Dan.
Yeah, thanks,
nice
Danny.
To see you.
Everyone, it's a great honor to be here. I've been absolutely blown away by the speakers and the attendees of the show here. It's been absolutely fantastic. So, wearable devices are nothing new, and connected health devices have been around for a couple decades now. But over the last 5 years, we've seen an explosion of activity around connected or smart wearable devices. And I would wager that a lot of people in this room have at some point in the last 5 years owned a Fitbit or a smartwatch or something like that. And according to the research that we've been running for the last 3 or 4 years on abandonment, I'd also wager that a non-insignificant proportion of you have also abandoned a wearable device. Now, I think we'd all agree that wearable technology has incredible potential. I mean, we are in the very nascent days of this domain, particularly from a health perspective. But you know, there's also a lot of healthy skepticism out there, particularly as we look at this wave of connected wearable devices as it applies to health problems. So what I'd like to do today is spend a little bit of time taking apart the industry. Where are we today? What are the real problems we're faced today? And then spend the second half and lay out a few factors, slightly more subtle factors that I think are going to move us into the future. Now, I find that when thinking about the evolution of the smart wearable market, you know, I find that it kind of tracks the life of a human. And by that I mean, you know, if we travel back in time 5 years ago, we were squarely in the adorable baby phase of this industry. Everyone loved it, you know. The future was wide open. And everyone wanted to hold the baby, you know. There was this rush of attention. And back in those days, and still today, over the last 5 years, you know, this industry started fairly modestly. You know, we particularly on the consumer side, we had the step counters, and then we added more generalized activity tracking and calorie sensing, and then people began to add the layers of behavior change around that. But all the while, we were aspiring to these much more meaningful health experiences. You know, people were seeing all of these developments with biosensors and with artificial intelligence and machine intelligence. And as we go up and to the right, we begin to see these much more profound and impactful experiences. Contextual stress management, this whole concept of a generalized health coach that can help you understand the causal mechanisms in your own health and help prescribe and predict things that are really custom for you. And particularly within the health sphere, you know, while people have found ungodly uses for wearable technology, including mind-controlled cat ears, which always makes an appearance at CES every year, I think a lot of folks look at chronic disease and look at wearable technology as a potential new tool in our fight against chronic disease. Now, these stats are of no surprise to anyone here. In fact, I've learned more statistics about chronic disease being at this event this week. But what I find really interesting, while wearable technology is transforming the way we diagnose and manage chronic disease, perhaps the largest opportunity here is the way we prevent the onset of chronic disease. And what's really exciting is if you look at activity trackers and fitness tracking and the layers of incentives we're able to wrap around those experiences, this is becoming a new tool that we've never had before to reach patients. And particularly those patients, for those of you familiar with the trans-theoretical behavioral model, there are several patients out there who are intrinsically motivated to change, and they're the ones out there buying Fitbits for themselves. And there are folks at the other end of that spectrum who eat steak for dinner every night and are going to go out with a bang. And you know, I think there's some really interesting developments about how we begin to reach patients even further down that stack. Now, like any adorable baby, you know, everyone wants to be around the baby. And so what we've seen over the last 5 years is this massive collection of companies that have launched wearable products, consumer wearable products. I've been trying to find a category of company that hasn't done this yet, and I was like, well, maybe there's a dog food company. I'm like, oh, well, there's people doing pet activity trackers now. This year, in the Christmas season, we're going to have about 100 new consumer-oriented smart wearable devices hitting the market. The Fossil Group this year launched 100 products this year. Now, as we get into 2016, you know, we've begun to hear these mumblings of, hey, does activity tracking really work? You know, there have been a number of kind of high-profile articles over the last few months about the efficacy of activity tracking. And a lot of healthy skepticism of, is this technology really going to have an impact on the health world? And so as we follow our human along, I feel like we're now kind of in the awkward teenage years. You know, we have issues with reliability. You know, we have some issues around, you know, abandonment, things like that. And, you know, as I work with companies in the space, you know, building a wearable product is probably one of the hardest things you can do. Companies out there building these devices face a myriad of challenges, from getting the hardware working to building something that is going to be comfortable to building something that's not going to look atrocious that you're going to want to put on every day, thinking about privacy, data security, the value proposition. But there are three problems in particular that are the most insidious right now that we're dealing with. The first one is what I call the daily burden of ownership. Anyone who's ever owned a wearable device does a simple math equation every morning when they wake up. And it's a division problem. In the numerator is the benefit that this wearable device is going to provide me today. And in the denominator is the burden of ownership. Is it comfortable? Does it look okay? Do I have to charge the battery? Can I shower with it on? And a lot of people, when they first get a wearable device, there's this novelty factor, right? But over time, that kind of erodes. And one day, they wake up and that ratio has fallen below 1, and that device ends up in a desk drawer. So the industry can solve the numerator of that problem, making devices that have a more compelling user value proposition, or we can solve the denominator by making devices that have better battery lives, that are more invisible, that aren't such a burden to own. The second one is what I call the non-invasive biosensing with a high end value problem. Now, today we've gotten to a point where we can fairly reliably track your heartbeat from your wrist. We can track your galvanic skin response, skin temperature. But there is so much research out there about these other approaches from a biosensing perspective. And the pattern that happens to a lot of companies is they start with this really compelling non-invasive sensing modality. And they get it working on a bunch of people in the lab. And what they find is that about 80% of the people out there, their mechanism works. But there's about 20% of the people for whom it has no effect, or it doesn't measure correctly, or they can't get the reliability up. And this is an absolutely devastating problem to have as a product company, when your product doesn't work consistently, because those 20% of the people are those people on your Amazon page giving you 1-star reviews. And the third one is safe and consistently robust insights from data. You know, all this time people have been saying, well, I don't want steps. I want insights. I want actionable insights. Now, if you're Netflix, developing insights about someone's viewing habits is pretty easy. Simple correlation, and if you give me a wrong movie title, I'll probably just ignore it. But when it comes to generating insights from health data, we have to remember that most of these devices have a very thin slice of our lives. They're lacking so much context, and while they may find correlations in the patterns of our lives, this does not necessarily reflect causal relationships in our health. And so in order to do this right, we have to make sure that they're going to be robust, most of the time to maintain user trust, but we also have to make sure that they're going to be safe. And so even though we're 5 years into this industry, if you buy a state-of-the-art activity tracker with heart rate tracking now, I can show you your resting heart rate, but I can't tell you why it's 10 beats per minute higher today than it was yesterday. But I can give you an American Heart Association article that might help you explain what resting heart rate means. And so what's happened is we're in this sort of a bit of a dark ages right now, a bit of a plateau with wearable technology, where we had all this wonderful forward momentum, and then we kind of hit this gap. Most of the industry is fairly conservative and is still down in the lower left-hand portion of this graph. You know, we see new products hitting the market today, and you look at the features and specifications. So this could have come out 2 or 3 years ago. I thought we would have been beyond this by now. And while there are a lot of companies in the upper right doing some really neat things, there's some trailblazers out there, and a lot of them are here today. You know, getting to a point where we're doing this stuff accurately and robustly, where it's working across populations of people, is really hard. So So what do we do? What's going to happen? These three problems that we're dealing with here are kind of fundamental technology problems, right? They're not things that we can solve with better policy or better industrial design. These are technology problems. And what I'd like to offer you now are sort of 5 factors that I see at play in the industry that are quietly accelerating the pace of innovation and that I think are going to be what's ultimately going to move us into this next period of growth over the next few years, where we're going to see immense bifurcation and creativity in the approaches and modalities. And I think we're going to look back in 5 or 10 years at a Fitbit and chuckle to ourselves that this was sort of the state of the art in 2015 and 2016. The first, which is probably pretty obvious, is that the wearable ecosystem now has its own supply chain. If you were building a wearable device in the year 2011, you were basically building an airplane out of car parts. You were basically stealing from the smartphone supply chain, the medical device supply chain, and while the components in those supply chains are optimized for a lot of the same problems, they're not a perfect substitution. And so we've seen a huge number of component suppliers, including Boston's own Analog Devices, who's here today, building components that are tiny, that use very little power, that have an incredible amount of embedded processing, that are helping us sort of unlock better biosensing, longer battery life. But we also see a whole ecosystem above this of software providers, manufacturing partners, design partners, who now specialize in wearable technology, who now understand if we're going to do industrial design for something that lives on your wrist, that this is a really hard problem, and we've done it a couple times, and we know how to get it right. And so the world is a lot different now for wearable startups here in the year 2016 than it was back in the year 2011. So a couple neat examples. So this is the Oura ring. I have one right now. I'm not usually a ring guy, but this is in this ring is a optical heart rate sensing, temperature sensing, activity tracking, and this is a device. It's supposedly one of the best sleep analysis devices on the market today. But it's in this beautiful ceramic package. I wouldn't call it invisible, but it is probably one of the sleekest industrial designs that I've seen. The Vital Patch by VitalConnect, which Philips has licensed. This is demonstrating how low cost these components have become. This is a disposable patch that you can put on a patient when they're admitted or in a remote monitoring application. The bat has about a 4 or 5 day battery life. It connects via Bluetooth. It does, I think it's 3 lead EKG, temperature and activity, and then when you're done, you throw it away, and you get a new one. So the supply chain is enabling us to build devices that are so cheap now that they can be disposable. And we also see products that have such a long battery life and that don't look so bad that you don't really mind wearing them. So those of you familiar with the Activité by Withings, or this is the new Misfit Phase that was just released yesterday under the umbrella of their new sort of fossil overlords. But it's a very, very beautiful device, and it doesn't scream, I'm a fitness tracker. It's like, hey, it's just a nice looking watch. The second factor is the combinatorial opportunities that are out there. Now, while the wearables ecosystem is marching along at sort of its own exponential growth, there are all these surrounding domains, all these other technological domains that are increasing at the same rate, where the pace of innovation is just incredible. And some of the most creative companies out there today are finding ways to capitalize on all of these innovations happening in these adjacent domains and combine them in novel ways to create radical new ways of doing things. I was talking to someone last week from the gaming industry, talking about all of the psychology that goes into mobile gaming now, and how these mechanisms, and we heard a lot of these same themes this week, have enormous potential from a behavior change perspective, because that's what a lot of the mobile gaming industry is. And we live in an exciting time now, because here in 2016, there are things we can do this year that we couldn't do last year, right? And so the pace of innovation, the pace of progress is mind-blowing, and it's really, the future is going to be owned by those who can think creatively enough about how to combine these different technologies in really novel ways. And that brings me to my third factor. A lot of people say innovation, and they think of innovation as just sort of forward progress, doing things differently. But from a systems perspective, there are actually a lot of different kinds of innovation. There's what we call incremental innovation. And this is where we preserve the goal of the system, we preserve the overall approach. In fact, we take the same system architecture and we just make it a little better. This year's laptop is a little faster than last year's laptop because we have a faster processor. The Apple Watch 2 has the same exact architecture as the Apple Watch 1. It's just a little better. We have architectural innovation. And the difference here is that we have the same pieces of the system, but we think about creative ways to arrange those pieces differently. And I think a great example of this is moving from a Holter monitor to a patch. And we have the same sensors. We're just thinking about the body as a piece of the system and how we can arrange the pieces of the system differently. And then we have radical innovation. This is where we preserve the system goal, but we take a radically different overall approach. And I think Quell, Neurometrics, who's here today, is a wonderful example of this. We take pain meds, and instead of using pain meds, we now have a wearable device that treats chronic pain. And what's interesting is that these patterns of innovation occur in all different industries, but usually when we see something breakthrough, when we achieve a breakthrough in performance against some parameter or some trajectory, it's usually companies innovating at the architectural or the radical level. And this is something that startups tend to be very good at. In larger companies who tend to have a lot of institutional knowledge about how things get done, tend to have a slightly harder time with thinking about other ways to build a system and bring it together. So here are a few examples of some companies that are out there. I think trailblazing. It's neat that a lot of them are here, or at least a good percentage of them. But we see companies taking these technologies, combining them in really novel ways, and solving all sorts of different problems with smart connected wearable devices. Now, not all of them will work at scale. Some of these devices are going to be the kinds of products that work really well on 60% of the people who get them, and those companies probably won't survive. But they're a first trailblazer out there, and other people will build where they failed. The fourth factor, is what I refer to as the democratization of machine intelligence. Machine learning has been a bit of a panacea for the last 5 years. It's like, hey, you got a technology problem? Like, have you sprinkled some machine learning on that? And while machine intelligence offers incredible potential today, it's also, I think, fairly misunderstood in terms of the kinds of problems it's good at solving and the kinds of problems we're still probably a couple decades away from. But what has happened is that if you wanted to hire a machine learning specialist 5 or 6 years ago, you'd be hiring from MIT or Stanford, these kind of niche pocket groups. But today, there's been this immense democratization of machine learning. There are tons of courses on it, on Coursera. Many universities are offering programs in this now. But what's really neat is there's been this explosion of platforms and libraries. So one thing that's happened over the last year is Google quietly open sourced TensorFlow. Now, TensorFlow is Google's basically deep learning platform that they use for Google image search and a bunch of Google products. And what's so neat about TensorFlow is that it is both a super flexible research platform, and it's also a high performance production platform. So you can run TensorFlow on a Raspberry Pi single board computer, and you can also run it across 1,000 compute clusters on AWS. So we have this set of tools out there that are now available to companies that just did not exist a couple years ago. And this is going to help really unlock a lot of interesting secrets, because now people are really understanding how these tools work and how to apply them to the right problems. The last one is the way we think about behavior change. I mean, a lot of this really comes down to engagement and behavior change, doesn't it? I mean, if we're going to give someone a device and nothing else, chances are that nothing's going to happen. And I think there's been an incredible amount of innovation over the last 5 years and learning about, in addition to giving someone the hardware, what are the other layers of the onion that we need to put in place to get the engagement rates way up? Way back in the old days, it was the user and their pedometer and the data. And then, the Fitbits of the world began adding badges and goals, all within the app. It's just you and the app. No one's going to care if you decide to stop using it one day. And then we added the social connections. So if you stop using it, well, your friends might say, hey, I walked more steps than you this week, and that bumped things up. And then we saw the emergence of this cohort of employee wellness and disease management platforms that wrap an extra layer of incentives, an extra layer of sticks and carrots around that experience. And there have been a lot of failures there that we've learned a lot about what not to do in that space. But there's also companies like Virgin Pulse here in Boston that have achieved really high engagement rates after 9 months, way beyond just an organic engagement rate with the device, because they've embraced this. One of the things I took away from reading The Internet of Healthy Things is all the really interesting work here at Partners, working on these personalized multimodal contextual engagements, learning about when is the right time to engage someone, what's the right place. We have access to a lot of that data now, and providing this perception of there being a human at the other end who's actually looking at this data. This is called the Sentry effect that Dr. Kavita talks about in his book. And so as we've added more layers to the onion, we have more and more tools that allow us to begin reaching populations kind of further down that stack I talked about earlier. But what I think is going to be most impactful, and we heard a lot of these themes this week, is beginning to take machine intelligence and apply it to the vast diversity that we have in human behavior, right? Because not everyone is motivated by the same things. Certain incentive programs work differently for different people, and so the extent to which we can rely on all of these developments in machine intelligence to create behavior regimens that are highly optimized for certain behavior will help move us even further than we are today. So I remain, despite a lot of the, I think, mixed signals out there, we are in the early days right now. But I think what we're going to begin to see is, we've been in this plateau for a few years, but I see an accelerating path forward. And I think we're going to begin to enter sort of an age of enlightenment, if you will, over the next sort of 5 or 8 years as we sort of work through this set of challenges. So I'll close by saying, if I write a lot about this stuff. You can find some of my research here. We've done a lot of research on consumer behavior patterns around this. We've taken these factors apart. In fact, the latest white paper really takes apart the problems around machine intelligence. Here's my email and my Twitter feed. But thank you for your time and have a great weekend.